Well, recently, about 17 million Canadian households received a census form in the mail. About 25% of those are long-form questionnaires asking some very personal questions about things like sexual orientation, household income, daily routines, ancestry, and utility expenses. An Alberta couple thinks the questionnaire goes too far, though, and they're challenging it in court. Linda Osborne is one of the complainants, along with her husband, Brad. Hatim Kheir is a constitutional lawyer with the Charter Advocates Canada, and they all join us now to discuss the case. Welcome to all three of you.
Hi.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, so let's start with Linda. So Linda, lawyers funded by the Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedoms have filed an application in federal court on behalf of you and your husband, so yourself and Brad right there. So when you two got the census form, what set the alarm bells off for you?
Actually, my husband got the census form, and he started reading it over the phone because I don't have a computer at home. And it started asking very personal questions about health, for example. There were questions like, do you have difficulty hearing even when wearing a hearing aid? And do you have difficulty seeing even with glasses? And do you have difficulty using your stairs or your fingers or your hands? Memory problems, emotional and psychological questions about my mental health. And I just began to feel uncomfortable with the intrusiveness of some of these questions.
Yeah, it's a little cumbersome. So your husband's reading it over the phone to you. You guys are kind of filling it out together?
Yes, because it's a census, and so it's not a personal thing. It's to be done by the household.
Gotcha, yes. And Hatim, what does this court application actually say?
So we're arguing that a number of the questions included on the long form questionnaire of the 2026 census, some of which were identified by Linda just now, we're making two arguments. First, that they're unconstitutional. They infringe the right to privacy that Canadians have protected by Section 7 and 8 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But then also there's an administrative issue because the government is empowered to administer the census by the Statistics Act. And the Statistics Act provides for different types of questions. There's census questions, and then there's statistical questions, which can be voluntary or mandatory, and certain steps have to be followed if they're going to be mandatory. The government has to publish that it's making these questions mandatory. There's also the issue that these two types of questions are made by different officials. But what the government did with the 2026 census is it's treated all these questions as if they're census questions. And so our argument is that essentially that's not true. Census question has to mean something. It's connected to the purpose of what a census is. It's there to allow the government to know how many citizens it has, where they live, and how to draw electoral boundaries. But the types of questions that were included in the long form questionnaire, asking about people's gender, sexuality, health problems, they go far beyond that purpose.
Yeah, okay. So some of them just specifically go too far because most of those mentioned in the intro there could be relevant for understanding what our population just simply looks like, right? Like what people are paying for their utilities, what the average household incomes are. But it sounds like those weren't the questions that you had the issues with. It just was kind of diving a little too deep, wasn't it?
Well, it's a whole host of questions. Like Linda identified, there's very detailed questions about people's health status. And again, the Statistics Canada has the power to ask statistical questions to gather information in a lot of different ways.
Right.
But they can do that voluntarily, like a normal survey, or they can make it mandatory. And once they do that, they are using the power of the state to compel Canadians to answer questions about themselves. And where those questions start to veer into people's private lives, into what the court calls our biographical core, then it begins to intrude on people's reasonable expectation of privacy.
Hatim, for Canadians who don't know, what are the legal ramifications of not filling out your census form?
So, under the Statistics Act, it is an offense not to fill out a census questionnaire, and it can be fined up to $500.
No, okay, pretty hefty. And I understand that Canadians who have not filled out their census forms might be getting a phone call from Statistics Canada or an in-person visit, even if if it does this seem like an overreach for somebody to come knocking on your door?
Well, again, turning back to our claim, there are questions. The census is in the Constitution Act. The government actually has to do one every 10 years, and it's for good reason. We have a democracy, and it's based on people's electoral ridings, and to make sure that those ridings are fairly sized and that there's a similar number of people in each riding. The government has to know where people live and how many people live in each household. The issue with this census, particularly the long form questionnaire, is that it veers outside of that core of questions. So if we were just talking about those core questions, then it would be reasonable for Statistics Canada to follow up, right? But the problem here is that they're following up to require Canadians to answer these intrusive questions.
Yeah. And Linda and Brad, we understand that the claims that, missing a census can result in lower community population counts, which directly influence federal funding for neighborhood hospitals, transit, and schools. And there are certainly a wide variety of views being shared on social media about that. So what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I don't really think all of that is valid to some extent, but I don't really feel like, particularly the emotional questionnaire, I think they don't need to know that maybe I struggle with anxiety or fears, depression, those kind of things. Maybe I'm having a bad day. It seems a little bit intrusive to have to be honest and share all that stuff with on a census form.
Yeah. Maybe they're just wanting to know how many people in the country are suffering from anxiety and depression so that they can look at a gauge and be like, wow, anxiety and depression is really going up. What's going on here in our society?
If I can chime in, I'll just add that, again, there are avenues that Statistics Canada can use to obtain that sort of information, and they can also use voluntary avenues to obtain that information. The issue here is that it's both being made mandatory and it's being fused into the census, which is supposed to be its own thing and serves particular constitutional purposes.
Yeah, so true. Brad and Linda, not everyone would step forward into the spotlight and do this. So why did you two decide to step into the fray?
Well, I just feel very strongly about our freedoms in Canada. I think that our freedom needs to be protected. And I feel that these questions, and we haven't even, there's upwards of 60 questions, very personal ones, and we've only alluded to some of them here. There's sexual orientation. Some of those questions, for example, this is a household thing. What if in a family, one person does not want to disclose their sexual orientation, and yet they are required to, by law, answer truthfully? So I just feel like on behalf of other Canadians, I have a responsibility to speak up. I have a responsibility to, and a desire to uphold the freedoms in Canada. And so that's just my reason. I felt very uncomfortable with many of these questions. And I just feel that somebody needs to speak up. And so I did.
All right. Hatim, you've been quoted as saying the census serves an important constitutional function, which I think most Canadians would agree with, obviously. But when it comes to our charter rights, where do you draw the line?
The courts have identified that we have a reasonable expectation of privacy to our biographical core. And so when information starts to veer into that sort of detailed personal information, not just sort of general information, where do you live, how old are you, that sort of thing. But when it starts to veer into health problems, mental health, sexual orientation, things that people consider private, things that people should be able to control when and how they disclose, that's when the government is veering in and performing a search, legally speaking, and doing so must be it must be constitutional. It must be justified.
Yeah. What are the Osbornes looking for with this legal challenge?
So the challenge is aimed at the questions included in the long form census questionnaire and the order of Statistics Canada requiring them to complete it. So if the application is granted, what would be quashed is this requirement being placed on them, and by setting that precedent on other Canadians who've been required to answer these private questions.
Yeah, no, exactly. Especially in this day and age of growing digital data retention, right? Who knows where this could go? So this is it's heading to court just now. So how long before we could see a decision on this?
Usually about a year for judicial review. I can't, the court moves on its own timeline, but usually about a year when you count the exchange of evidence, legal arguments, and actually getting to court for a hearing.
Yeah, court, it's not exactly a speedy process. It's like a sloth and molasses, isn't it? All right. Okay, well, thank you all for coming on to talk about this. If there's anything else you wish to add that I didn't ask, now's your time.
I'll just add that you raised an interesting point just at the end there about us living in a digital age.
Yeah.
And the amount of information that's being collected has a very different impact nowadays than it would have, let's say, in the 1950s, where your information would have been collected by paper and sitting in a filing cabinet somewhere in Statistics Canada's possession. Whereas nowadays it'll be on a database, which means it's potentially open to large-scale data analysis by the government. It's open to potentially security breaches, which are much more easily done. Nowadays that could be done virtually or with a USB stick at the most, versus a truckload trying to remove a large number of paper questionnaires. And so the risk to privacy by compiling and collecting all this detailed information is much higher nowadays than it would have been in a pre-digital age.
Thank you all for coming on to talk about this. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Linda and Brad Osborne live in Foothills County, Alberta, and Hatim Kheir is a constitutional lawyer with Charter Advocates Canada.